In the damp, shadowy night of Louisiana's swamp country, a 12-year-old boy who couldn't speak, couldn't cry for help, vanished through an unlocked window. His name was Bryan Vasquez. And just 12 days later, his body was found deep in the swamp where alligators lurk, waiting for prey. But Bryan didn't just die because of nature. He died because too many hands failed to protect him, long before that night. That night, Bryan wore nothing but an adult diaper, exposed, vulnerable, defenseless in a world that had already failed him. There were no warning signs, no screams, just the terrifying silence of a home that had stopped being safe. His mother called the police, but hours passed before search teams were sent out. And in the swamp, every minute matters. Every minute was a chance for Bryan to survive. And every minute that passed slipped away. When his body was finally found, the community was heartbroken. A nonverbal child, abused by his own mother since he was just 3 months old, now gone, alone. People asked, why was a child once removed from an abusive home sent back into it? Why was the window never locked when his mother knew he tended to wander off? And why did it take so long for police to respond when every second was life or death? This wasn't just a missing person case. It was an indictment of a system that abandoned the very people it was meant to protect. Bryan Vasquez was born into vulnerability. He couldn't speak. He couldn't express himself with words. The only way he connected to the world was through his eyes and the awkward movements of his tiny hands and feet. Neighbors recall moments when Bryan would sit by the window for hours, staring out, as if waiting for another world to come and take him away. He didn't speak English. He didn't understand Spanish, the only two languages spoken around him. Bryan lived in his own world, where silence was the only language he knew. But behind that silence was a history of pain. When Bryan was just 3 months old, his mother, Hilda Vasquez, was convicted of child abuse. A fractured skull, a collapsed lung, tiny legs, badly injured. Bryan survived that brutal beginning. But the scars, physical and in his case files, never faded. Social services once stepped in. He was removed from his mother's custody. But somehow, years later, he was placed right back in the same home, with the same person who once nearly killed him. Some said Hilda loved her son, in her own way, but it was a love that flickered, unstable, like a candle in the wind. She lived with several other children in a cramped home near the swamps. Neighbors often heard screaming from inside, but never really saw Bryan play or laugh or be a child. To many, Bryan was different, but he was also the kind of child everyone instinctively wanted to protect. On the rare occasions he was taken outside, Bryan would cling tightly to something small. Sometimes an old toy car, sometimes just a piece of fabric. These were his anchors in a chaotic world. One neighbor remembered finding Bryan wandering near a busy road, alone, having slipped out of the yard. They brought him home, hoping it would be safer next time. But the house never changed. The windows stayed unlocked. The doors, still easy to push open. This isn't just a story about a nonverbal child. It's the story of a boy who had already been hurt, who had once been saved, and then was sent back to the very place that would cost him his life. And that tragedy came to pass on the morning of August 14th. But what really happened on that fateful morning? August 14th, 2025. The sun hadn't yet risen. Inside a small house tucked near the swamps of New Orleans, silence hung heavy in the air. Only the sounds of buzzing insects, trickling water from nearby ditches, and thick humidity creeping through every crack in the walls. Around 5 a.m., Bryan, wearing nothing but an adult diaper, slipped out through an unlocked window. No one will ever know exactly how he did it. He couldn't speak. He couldn't call for help. But somehow, those small hands managed to push the window open, and his fragile feet carried him into the unknown. When Hilda, Bryan's mother, woke and found his bed empty, panic set in. A nonverbal child, who couldn't say his name, who didn't know how to find his way back, out there in a maze of swamps and canals. Hilda called the police, but it would take hours before her report led to any real response. In that time, neighbors began to gather. They asked the questions no one wanted to answer. Why wasn't the window locked? Didn't Bryan wander off before? Someone added, that boy was taken from her once. He should have never been back in that house. Police arrived and documented the scene. An open window, no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture. The house was still, as if Bryan had simply vanished. But everyone knew the truth. In this part of Louisiana, when a child disappears, the clock begins ticking fast. The Louisiana swamps are no place to survive alone. Beneath those dark waters are dangers waiting, venomous snakes, disease-carrying mosquitoes, and worst of all, alligators. That night, police assembled a search team. But in many hearts, the fear had already settled into dread. Had they waited too long? Had this little boy, unable to speak, unable to scream, already lost his chance the moment he stepped out that window? As daylight rose higher, the search widened. Men from the neighborhood grabbed flashlights and walking sticks, scanning the canal banks. Women and children gathered in yards, praying quietly. No one said it out loud, but they were all thinking the same thing. A nonverbal child, lost in the swamp. His chances were painfully slim. The swamps surrounding New Orleans are a different world. Black water, the stench of rot rising from still canals. Wild grass growing chest high, hiding anything beneath it. In a place like that, a child can disappear in minutes, without a trace. Helicopters were called in, circling overhead. Thermal cameras scanned the land below. Police boats combed through narrow waterways, turning through every bend. But all they found were ripples in the water, a few broken branches. No footprints, no clothing, no clues. Hilda stood at a distance, watching. She cried. Her hands shook. She begged them to find Bryan. But behind her, whispers grew louder. She abused him before. Didn't social services take him away once? Why'd they give him back? Her grief, raw and real, began to blend with the quiet judgment of the community, leaving her caught in a storm of sorrow and suspicion. One day passed, then two, then three. The vast swamp seemed to swallow every effort. Some still hoped Bryan had wandered into an abandoned house, or a patch of dry land, and was somehow alive. Others believed he was gone the very first morning. But no one gave up, because giving up meant admitting defeat, and no one was ready to do that. Then came day 12. A search team moved along a deep canal behind the neighborhood, the kind of place sunlight can't even reach. That's where they found Bryan's body. Small, silent, terribly injured. The autopsy stunned the community. Bryan had drowned. There were also signs of an alligator attack. But the story didn't end there. In many ways, it had only just begun. Why did Bryan go outside in the first place? And why were all the warnings, the unlocked window, the prior abuse, the danger signs, ignored until it was far too late? When news broke that Bryan had been found, the community was stunned. But alongside the grief came questions, and each answer seemed to reveal deeper contradictions. Hilda said she was asleep, and that when she woke up, her son had vanished through the window. But neighbors remembered, this wasn't the first time Bryan had tried to leave the house. Some had seen him wandering before. They'd even warned Hilda. If she knew this, why wasn't the window secured? Why weren't there any safety measures in place for a nonverbal child who couldn't ask for help? Police, too, came under fire. The family made the call early in the morning, but it took several hours before a search was actually launched. And in a missing child case, every minute matters. So why the delay? Some began to say it out loud. Was it because this was just a poor family, a disabled child of color, that the case wasn't taken seriously? When Bryan's body was pulled from the water, people cried. But those tears weren't just for a lost child. They were tears of outrage. Because everyone knew Bryan had once been removed from his mother's care after suffering severe abuse as an infant. And yet, somehow, the system allowed him to return. Now, all that remained was a child lost to the swamp, and 1,000 questions no one could answer. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death, drowning with injuries from an alligator attack. But one detail left investigators deeply unsettled. There was no clear evidence showing how Bryan ended up in the water. No one knew if he walked there himself, if someone left him, or worse, if someone pushed him. Attention turned back to the house where Bryan had disappeared. The bedroom window had been opened, but showed no signs of forced entry, only the marks of a small child opening it from the inside. Still, neighbors were skeptical. Bryan couldn't have done all that on his own, one said. He was nonverbal, barely understood instructions. How would he know how to open a window and get out like that? Then came the deeper history, Hilda Vasquez's past. Records showed that when Bryan was just 3 months old, he had suffered a fractured skull, broken legs, and a collapsed lung. Injuries that could not have been accidental. Hilda had been convicted and placed under supervision, Bryan had been removed from her care, but years later, the system allowed him to return, as if the past had never happened. Now, that decision was being called a fatal mistake. The community itself was divided. Some felt sympathy for Hilda, a struggling single mother left without support, trying to raise multiple children in poverty. Others were furious. They believed she had failed her son, that she had allowed a vulnerable, defenseless child to live in an unsafe home under the care of the very person who once hurt him. And the police? Records showed it took over 5 hours after the initial 911 call for a search team to be officially deployed. In a child disappearance, 5 hours can mean the difference between life and death. And the haunting question echoed. If the missing child hadn't been nonverbal, disabled, a child of color, would the response have been faster? All of these pieces formed a dark, incomplete picture, because by now it was clear. Many people knew Bryan had been neglected. Many saw the danger, but no one truly stepped in to stop it. This wasn't just a story about a child or a mother. This was a story about a system that failed, from child services to law enforcement to the very community meant to protect its most vulnerable. When Bryan's death was confirmed, the public wanted someone to blame. And the first to face that wave of outrage was Hilda Vasquez, his mother. Her past became headline news. When Bryan was just 3 months old, Hilda had been convicted of child abuse. The autopsy back then recorded horrifying injuries, a fractured skull, broken legs, and a collapsed lung. An infant had nearly died in his mother's hands. Though Hilda later insisted she had changed, the records never disappeared. And now, they became the evidence everyone pointed to. She hurt him once, and this time, she let him die. Hilda pleaded her innocence. During questioning, she cried, saying she had done her best, that Bryan must have slipped out the window while she was asleep. But instead of sympathy, the criticism only grew louder. If she knew her son had a habit of wandering, why wasn't the window locked? If she had once lost custody for abuse, why, when given a second chance, did she let him live in a home full of risks? To the community, there were no good answers. On social media, the backlash was merciless. She never deserved to be a mother. That boy died because of her neglect. Don't call it an accident, call it what it is, a crime. Public outrage quickly turned into legal action. The district attorney charged Hilda with 2 counts, negligent homicide and second-degree cruelty to a juvenile. To many, it was the justice Bryan deserved. But others asked, are we just dumping the blame on one poor mother instead of holding accountable the system that failed this child from the start? It felt like the case had reached its conclusion, a clear suspect, a tragic ending. But then, new questions began to surface. Even with charges filed against Hilda, the community wasn't done asking. Was it really just one mother's failure? Or had others also played a role in Bryan's death? First, the local police. Records show that more than 5 hours passed between Hilda's initial 911 call and the deployment of an actual search team. In child abduction and missing persons cases, experts emphasize the golden window, the first 3 hours. If a child isn't found within that window, the chance of survival drops by nearly half. But here, 5 hours were lost, and no one could explain why. Then came Child Protective Services. It was the same system that once removed Bryan from his mother after the abuse. Yet years later, they approved his return, even though Hilda's criminal record and Bryan's medical history remained on file. And so, the painful question surfaced. Why was a child who nearly died in his mother's care ever sent back to her? Was it understaffing, budget cuts, or was it because Bryan was a disabled child of color and somehow just didn't matter enough? Then came another disturbing revelation. Neighbors said they'd seen Bryan wandering outside before. Once, a concerned neighbor had even walked him all the way home. If that's true, then Hilda wasn't the only one who overlooked warning signs. The community saw them. Authorities were aware, but no one acted to protect him. At this point, the tragedy stopped being about just one mother. It became an indictment of an entire system. A police department that responded too late. A child welfare agency that failed to intervene. A neighborhood that ignored the red flags. And that's when some people began to feel uneasy. Was charging Hilda the easiest way to close a heartbreaking case? By blaming a poor mother, had the system conveniently erased its own role in Bryan's death? If that's true, then Bryan's death isn't just a personal tragedy. It's a collective one, where everyone, in some way, had a hand in the outcome. After Hilda was charged, many assumed the story had reached its end. But one by one, each theory began to fall apart under the weight of new details. The first theory: Bryan opened the window himself, wandered off, and fell into the water. It sounded plausible until a pediatric specialist in developmental disabilities spoke up. A nonverbal child with cognitive challenges wouldn't have that level of orientation, and the window in that home isn't low. It's possible he opened it, but unlikely he climbed out completely without anyone noticing. If that's true, then who did open the window for Bryan? The second theory: Hilda neglected her son, and that neglect led to his death. But some neighbors claimed they heard footsteps outside the house around 4 a.m., before Hilda ever called the police. If that's accurate, Bryan may not have been alone. Someone else may have been out there, in the dark. The third theory: police were too slow, and that cost Bryan his life. But the records show, even with a faster response, the search zone was enormous. Deep water, swamp terrain, alligators. The odds of finding Bryan alive were slim from the start. So yes, law enforcement may have failed. But was that the deciding factor? As each theory revealed its flaws, the community slipped into confusion. People began arguing. This is the mother's fault. No, it's the system's fault. No, it was just a terrible accident that no one could have prevented. The truth shattered into fragments, and no one could see the full picture anymore. And in that vacuum, trust began to erode. In the weeks following Bryan's death, more details surfaced, but instead of bringing clarity, they only deepened the fog. First, a report from a witness who lived near the swampland. That morning, around dawn, they claimed to have seen the silhouette of an adult walking along the canal bank, not far from Bryan's house. A shadowy figure swallowed in the mist, too tall to be a child. If that account is true, Bryan didn't leave alone. But then, who was with him, and why? Next came blurry security footage from a home several blocks away. Around 5:20 a.m., it captured a small figure, stumbling, unsteady, crossing the screen. Many believe it was Bryan, but the image is too grainy to be sure. A lone, fragile shape, caught between truth and speculation. Then came a discovery buried in the files of social services. A forgotten note, written by a former caseworker who had since left the agency. This household is not a safe environment for a disabled child. There are multiple hazards. Recommend reviewing custodial rights. That recommendation was never followed up. The file was shelved, and Bryan was sent back. This wasn't just a clerical error. It was a decision, one that changed the course of a child's life forever. Each new detail only pushed the public deeper into crisis. Did Bryan die because of his mother's neglect? Because of the police delay? Or because a bloated, bureaucratic system let a warning set, unread, in a dusty folder? No one can say for certain. But each unanswered clue cuts deeper, into a wound that never had time to heal. A fragile child is gone. And instead of truth, all that remains is a trail of haunting questions. Will we ever truly know what happened to Bryan Vasquez? 12 days of searching, one body recovered, one mother charged. But even as the legal system moved forward, no one in the community felt that justice had truly been served. Because Bryan's death could never be explained by just two words: an accident. If it was an accident, why wasn't the window locked? If it was the mother's fault, why did the system allow a child to return to the very place that once left him broken? And if the system failed, why was the only person held accountable a poor, isolated woman? At Bryan's small funeral, the white casket looked lost among the sounds of muffled sobs. Next to it sat a single photo, Bryan smiling, eyes wide, as if trying to reach for something only he could see. For a brief moment, maybe the last, Bryan was remembered as a child, not a victim, not a case number, not a name on an autopsy report. The community mourned, but their grief came with a hollow ache, a void no verdict could fill, no silence could cover. On paper, the story of Bryan Vasquez is closed. A child drowned, attacked by an alligator, a mother facing criminal charges. But for those who followed his story, it never truly ended. It became the beginning of something else, a lingering heartbreak. Because when people speak of Bryan, they don't just remember how he died. They remember the chances that were lost. The Times neighbors warned about Bryan wandering, but no one followed up. The social services report that flagged his home as unsafe and was quietly forgotten in a drawer. The golden hours police let slip away when every minute might have meant a chance to save him. Bryan died in silence. And that silence didn't belong to him alone. It belonged to all of us, to a community, a system, a society that failed to protect one of its most vulnerable children. When you think of Bryan, you may feel anger toward his mother, or outrage at the police, or frustration with a broken bureaucracy. But no matter who you blame, one fact remains. A child who could not defend himself is gone, and no one who could have prevented it truly did. Maybe what makes this story so haunting is that we'll never know the full truth. Did Bryan slip out on his own? Did someone open the window and walk away? Or was it just a slow, quiet avalanche of missed chances, one mistake at a time, that led to a death no one stopped? No one knows. And maybe no one ever will. But one question still hangs in the air, waiting to be answered. Will we keep ignoring the next Bryan until it's too late? Or will we finally change?